Tonight, the ABC sits down with the estranged wife of the NT Anti-Corruption Commissioner. Growth in the Australian economy comes to a near standstill. India's Prime Minister grabs an unprecedented third term, but at a cost in the Parliament. And another chapter of an epic rivalry as Origin Game 1 kicks off in Sydney. Good evening, Kyle Dowling with ABC News. The ABC has obtained documents revealing the Northern Territory's Anti-Corruption Commissioner agreed to pay his estranged wife $20,000 at the same time she withdrew a domestic violence order against him. Emails show Michael Rich's lawyers suggested such an order would have jeopardised his employment and forced him to resign from his ICAC role. Sitting down with the ABC, Jennifer Riches says the alleged emotional abuse drove her to take action and leave the Territory.
Fearful and controlled. That's how Jennifer Riches felt after only 1 year of marriage to the Territory's sole corruption watchdog.
There were anger outbursts and things just were becoming harder and harder to navigate. And I just started to become really afraid of him.
The NT's independent commissioner against corruption, Michael Riches, alleged by his estranged wife to have controlled and manipulated her to the point where she had to flee her home.
You know, the intellectual kind of mind games and silent treatment and, you know, just because it's not physical doesn't mean that there's not severe, psychological, consequences to this stuff.
In May last year, Miss Riches took action, filing a domestic violence order against her partner and seeking a financial settlement to begin a new life in Sydney.
I think it was very tricky and it didn't sit well with me, but I felt like I was kind of trapped. There's no either that or I'm stuffed.
In legal correspondence, Mr. Riches' lawyers said the domestic violence order would force him to retire from his role as the ICAC, instead agreeing to a written undertaking which would see him restrained from approaching, contacting or remaining in the company of Miss Riches and would keep the matter out of the courts. In the same email, the lawyers rejected a $30,000 cash payment to Miss Riches for urgent spousal maintenance, instead proposing a total of $20,000 and the continuation of loan repayments as a partial property settlement, noting the offer is contingent upon Mr. Riches remaining in his employment as ICAC. 2 days later, the DVO was withdrawn, Miss Riches' lawyers telling her it is not in your best interests for your husband to no longer work in his high-paying job. Mr. Riches is now on personal leave from his position. The government refuses to say for how long, but said the ICAC's own watchdog, the ICAC inspector, would investigate allegations of wrongdoing. Mr. Riches has been contacted for comment. Oliver Chaseling, ABC News.
And if you or someone you know needs help, please contact 1800-RESPECT by phone or their website. The Northern Territory Director of Public Prosecution says no charges will be laid over the mysterious disappearance of Paddy Moriarty due to insufficient evidence. Mr. Moriarty and his dog Kelly vanished without a trace from the tiny outback town of Larrimah in 2017, sparking an intense police investigation which made headlines across the world. In 2022, the NT coroner referred the suspected death of Mr. Moriarty to the DPP, stating he believed the 70-year-old was killed due to an ongoing feud with his neighbour. While the DPP won't be taking further actions, NT Police says its investigations are ongoing and the $250,000 reward for information is still on offer. The NT government insists it is protecting Aboriginal artefacts and the environment from fracking in the Beetaloo Basin, despite a gas company reporting several breaches at a project near Borroloola. Traditional owners are angry Empire Energy didn't report Aboriginal stone tools close to one of its Carpentaria wells until 18 months after they were found. The company says this and other breaches, including storing fracking wastewater in dams with linear tiers and spilling drilling mud on the ground, have not caused material environmental harm. Traditional owners want to prevent Empire from starting the sale of gas, but the government says its regulation is adequate.
We have invested more money in this budget into monitoring the onshore oil and gas industry, and we'll continue to do that. But to assure Territorians, that is our absolute focus, is making sure that it is a safe industry and the impact on the environment is minimal.
With a death over the weekend putting domestic violence back in the spotlight in the Northern Territory, a new program in Alice Springs is hoping to tackle the issue head-on. A co-response model involving police, behavioural programs, legal and counselling services is hoping to make a difference. But as is often the story in the NT, there are concerns the funding falls short.
When it comes to tackling domestic violence, collaboration is key. That's the message shared by service providers at a conference in Alice Springs this week.
No organisation, no government agency can respond to domestic and family violence on their own.
That idea has formed the basis of a new program launched today in the Red Centre. When police respond to DV incidents, specialist services will provide support to victim survivors and perpetrators will be referred to behavioural change programs.
We need to recognise that the emergency response by police is insufficient. And we need to link women to housing, support services, legal supports, child protection.
The program has been long fought for by service providers who have criticised the government for plans they say were severely underfunded. A boost from the Commonwealth has got it up and running, but only for the next 2 years.
So about $1 million our government's investing particularly in this program. It will be a pilot. It's important to do those trials to see if something's going to work, and if it's working, of course we'll continue to invest in it.
While workers in the sector say it's an important step in the right direction, there are fears it still falls short.
We have to make sure that the services around this response are sufficiently funded and staffed.
A long way off similar models interstate.
Compare that to, say, the Queensland government's own commitment of in excess of $20 million over 4 years for their own co-responder model. No, it doesn't go far enough.
But it's agreed the current system is not working, so a step forward is a good way to start. Isabella Tolhurst, ABC News.
Growth in the Australian economy has spluttered to a virtual standstill as households continue to juggle high cost of living and larger mortgage repayments. But it might have been worse if it wasn't for spending on big ticket events like Taylor Swift and the Melbourne Grand Prix.
It's the recession Australia isn't having yet, and the Treasurer is clinging to the hope it won't arrive.
Any growth is welcome in these domestic and global circumstances that we confront.
Unlike the 1990s,
this is a recession that Australia had to have.
The record population growth is keeping Australia out of recession. But per person, we've gone backwards for 5 quarters in a row. The economy barely grew in the March quarter, taking GDP to 1.1% for the year. Household spending provided a lifeline, with Australians not only forking out for essentials, but also splashing some cash on travel to Asia, concerts and sporting events. That meant they saved a smaller portion of their income. Government spending was also up, but investment across the economy was down.
Well, forecasting is a difficult process.
The Reserve Bank Governor, grilled at Senate estimates ahead of the data release, remains hopeful of avoiding a recession.
The economy is very weak, but we've still got the labour market growing.
But that didn't stop this sobering warning.
If it turns out, for example, that inflation starts to go up again, or it's much stickier than we think, we're not getting it down, then we won't hesitate to move and raise interest rates again.
Given the bank wants to prevent job losses, ANZ economists don't think that will happen.
The chances of a hike, given they are trying to achieve and maintain the gains, as we heard a lot in Senate estimates today, that they're unlikely to hike again.
The RBA meets again later this month. Most economists believe the March quarter GDP data won't affect the board's current holding pattern, with the chances of a rate cut by the end of the year now slightly higher. Rachel Papazzoni, ABC News.
Australia's online safety regulator has dropped a high-profile legal case against Elon Musk's social media giant X. The e-safety commissioner wanted the platform to take down videos of the stabbing of a Sydney priest. The federal court case was shaping as a test of the regulator's global power, but has now been abandoned. Political reporter Tom Lowry has more.
The battle has been lost.
I made a strategic decision to withdraw here.
But the e-safety commissioner warns the fight is just beginning.
Let's face it, the war is going to be much longer and more extended.
In the wake of the stabbing of a Sydney bishop in April, the Online Safety Authority wanted to force X and other companies to take down graphic vision of the attack. Not just here, but globally.
The only way you can remove that content is at scale, is at the source.
X and its billionaire owner were quick to claim the win.
This case has raised important questions on how legal powers can be used to threaten global censorship of speech, and we're heartened to see that freedom of speech has prevailed.
Freedom of speech is worth fighting for.
Elon Musk took a personal interest in the case. Julian Mangrand says that carried consequences.
He issued a dog whistle to 181 million users around the globe, which resulted in death threats directed at me.
We back the e-safety commissioner, particularly in light of the reprehensible threats to her physical safety and the threats to her family.
It is an absolute disgrace that she and her family have been subjected to this online abuse.
This case was being closely watched as a test of a domestic authority's power to regulate a global space. Some have argued it would have been a hard one for the e-safety commissioner to win, and others hope highlighting the regulator's lack of power might push governments into action.
It may end up that the case for change will be proved by losing in court rather than by winning.
Media giant News Corp wants social media platforms to have to abide by a social licence. Essentially, a new set of tougher regulations and obligations as to how they operate in Australia.
It's time for them to play by our rules.
Given recent experience, that might be easier said than done. Tom Lowry, ABC News, Canberra.
The Greens have been accused of inciting violent pro-Palestinian protests and the vandalism of politicians' offices across the country in a fiery sitting of federal parliament. The party's leader insists the Greens are supporters of peaceful protest and have done nothing of the sort, accusing the Prime Minister of trying to make the war in Gaza all about him.
As Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese doesn't get to spend a whole lot of time at his Sydney electorate office, and for the last 6 months, none of his staff have been able to get in either.
Enough is enough.
Yeah. Frustration and anger over the picketing and vandalism of MPs' offices by pro-Palestinian protesters. Bipartisan blame for those accused of inciting it.
The time for senators and members of parliament to continue to attend and inflame tension outside these offices must end. Yeah.
The offices of elected members of parliament being targeted with red paint, with vile messages. The Greens should condemn it instead of condoning it.
I will not be lectured to about peace and non-violence by people who back the invasion of Gaza.
The Greens leader accusing Labor and the coalition of ignoring the horrific human cost of war.
Instead of talking about the victims, the Prime Minister wants to make it about himself.
Insisting his party members, elected or otherwise, are not to blame.
The Greens, as a party of peace and non-violence, support protest that is peaceful.
What happened in Parliament today was the culmination of months of frustration from Labor and the coalition that the Greens are using debate on the war in Gaza simply to win votes here at home. But the Greens' support for the Palestinian cause has been clear, long before this current chapter in the conflict began. And its argument that Australia isn't doing enough to call out Israel's offensive may well be resonating with parts of the community. Matthew Doran, ABC News, Canberra.
Health insurer Medibank plans to defend allegations it breached privacy laws in the lead-up to a massive data breach almost 2 years ago. The Information Commissioner will argue that Medibank failed to take reasonable steps to protect the personal information of nearly 10 million customers, which resulted in hackers posting their names, addresses and Medicare card numbers to the dark web. With so many affected, the maximum fine could reach into the trillions of dollars. Ultimately, it will be up to the federal court to determine the appropriate penalty.
Entities aren't going to be punished just for being
subject to a data breach, but they are going to be the subject of investigation by our office for failure to put reasonable steps in place to prevent such a breach from happening.
Coming up on 7:30 with Sarah Ferguson, the gifted boxer hoping to make it big.
There's a lot that goes into boxing if you want to make it to the world stage.
He's just always been a naturally gifted athlete and a natural talent.
Oh, big shot, big right hand from Coolwell.
He's very competitive on the inside, but very respectful for people and his opponents.
Also, I'll speak to Treasurer Jim Chalmers about today's GDP figures.
The official results from the 2024 Indian election are in. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been returned to power, but the result was much tighter than many were predicting. Tonight, the PM and his ruling BJP party have been forced to meet with political allies after failing to form a majority.
Modi! Modi!
Claiming victory, a rock star welcome for an expected and historic win. It's only the second time an Indian Prime Minister has claimed a third term.
We Indians will walk together towards the development of the country, and in this third term, the country will write a new chapter of big decisions.
But it's not the triumph Mr. Modi or his party might have wanted. The ruling BJP lost seats to a stronger than expected opposition, and for the first time in a decade, it did not secure a majority on its own.
The Prime Minister has lost his mandate. This is his political and moral defeat.
The verdict marks a surprising revival for the opposition India alliance led by Rahul Gandhi. They've won 234 seats. That's more than 40% of the lower house, a big boost for the scion of India's fabled political dynasty.
I would like to say to the people of my Uttar Pradesh that they have shown great wisdom and I am proud of them.
Keeping a close eye on election coverage, this street food vendor says after a decade of Mr. Modi, he'd hoped for change.
Business is down. Unemployment is there. The cost of living keeps rising. What are we supposed to do?
The PM is known for his strongman, decisive politics. But if his victory speech is anything to go by, Indians are likely to see a humbler Modi as he relies on his coalition partners to govern the country for the first time in a decade. It's a bittersweet victory for the BJP. Politically weakened, they're promising to do better.
We did not get the mandate we expected, but we are happy with whatever the people have given us.
And the people have spoken. A victory for democracy. Meghna Bali, ABC News, New Delhi.
Graphic excerpts from Hunter Biden's memoir have been used against him in his criminal trial in the US state of Delaware. The president's son has pleaded not guilty to 3 charges stemming from the purchase of a gun in 2018. North America correspondent Barbara Miller was in court in Wilmington.
Hunter Biden arrived at court to hear his own words turned against him. The prosecution playing lengthy excerpts from the audiobook of his memoir, which he narrated.
I've bought crack cocaine on the streets of Washington, D.C., and cooked up my own inside a hotel bungalow in Los Angeles.
The First Lady, Joe Biden, and other family members listened as he described his descent into addiction.
I possessed a new superpower, the ability to find crack in any town at any time, no matter how unfamiliar the terrain. I could get off a plane in Timbuktu and score a bag of crack.
The prosecution told jurors Hunter Biden knew what he was doing when he lied to purchase a gun in 2018. No one is above the law. Addiction may not be a choice, but lying and buying a gun is a choice. But the defence argued Hunter Biden did not believe he was addicted when he wrote on the paperwork that he did not have a drug problem. The defence lawyer said his client had no intent to deceive.
Earlier, one juror was replaced after sending a message to the judge that she didn't have a car and couldn't afford to get to the court by any other means. It was a reminder that it really is 12 ordinary Americans deciding a case with potential implications for a presidential election.
Hunter Biden's ex-wife is likely to be called soon, followed by a former lover, his brother's widow. Barbara Miller, ABC News, Wilmington, Delaware.
The United States President Joe Biden has issued a sweeping directive to stop most migrants seeking asylum at the US-Mexican border. The shutdown will go into effect immediately, but Republicans say it's too little, too late.
Facing mounting political pressure, the US president says it's time to gain control of the border.
I'm moving past Republican obstruction and using the executive authorities available to me as president to do what I can on my own to address the border.
Those caught crossing illegally could be quickly deported or turned back to Mexico under the measure. But the president says he's not demonising immigrants.
I'll never refer to immigrants as poisoning the blood of a country. And further, I'll never separate children from their families at the border.
The asylum ban kicks in when the daily average of border arrests hits 2,500. There will be exemptions for unaccompanied children and people who face serious medical or safety threats. For those waiting at the border today, it was a bitter blow.
I hope Joe Biden puts his hand on his heart and changes his mind to all migrants attempting to cross to the United States.
The former President Donald Trump and fellow Republicans slammed the plan as insufficient.
Why didn't you do this last month or the month before or the month before? How many dead bodies is enough?
The truth is that Joe Biden's executive order won't stop the invasion. It's weak and it's pathetic. It will actually make the invasion worse.
Immigration is high on the agenda for Americans in the run-up to the November elections. According to polls, Donald Trump is ahead on the issue of who would better handle border security. Joe Biden will be hoping today's announcement will bridge the gap. But immigration advocates are already flagging an appeal, accusing the president of backtracking on his legal obligations to protect asylum seekers. Carrington Clark, ABC News, Washington.
To finance now, and markets were largely unaffected by today's slightly weaker than expected GDP number. Here's Alan Kohler.
Well, Australia's economic growth has basically ground to a halt, which was no surprise to anyone. The only question was how close to zero it would be. The answer is as close as possible without being zero, 0.1% between December quarter and March quarter. Now, here's a longer-term perspective, 60 years of the annual growth rate. Now, I've drawn that dashed red line to show that while growth has been volatile, ranging from -3 to +9% in non-pandemic times, the 60-year trend has been steadily downwards. And it's worse when gross domestic product is divided by population to get per capita growth. Reserve Bank Governor Michelle Bullock says this isn't very useful considering we have low unemployment, but I beg to differ. It usefully shows how growth is being propped up by immigration. Per capita GDP fell in the March quarter for the 5th consecutive quarter. Final graph from the national accounts. The saving rate used to be about 5%, but after the fiscal largesse of the pandemic was spent, it now seems to be stuck at 1%, which is another symptom of the cost of living crisis. The dollar had a twitch upwards when the GDP came out, but is now slightly lower at 66.6 US cents. The share market also twitched, but stayed there, closing 0.4% higher with banks and retailers up, miners down. The Indian share market recovered 2% of yesterday's 5.7% loss following the surprising election result there. Other markets were mixed after a small rise in New York. And finally, oil, copper and gold went up last night, while iron ore fell again. And that's finance.
New South Wales and Queensland are set to clash in Sydney for Game 1 of the 2024 State of Origin series. Reporter Bindi Bryce is at Sydney Olympic Park. Bindi, how are these two rivals shaping up?
Yeah, it's certainly shaping up to be an interesting one, and most of the focus heading into this series has been on the new Blues coach, Michael Maguire, who's been brought in after New South Wales lost the last couple of series and sacked Brad Fittler. He's certainly put his stamp on this side, There's going to be 5 debutants for New South Wales in this side tonight, but there's been a lot of focus on his decision to axe the captain, James Tedesco, in favour of Penrith's Dylan Edwards. Dylan Edwards has hurt his quad at training, so Teddy has been called back into this squad, and a lot of people are tipping him to want to put in a massive performance tonight for New South Wales. For Queensland, they're going to be looking to go 3 in a row in this series, which would be a massive achievement for coach Billy Slater. Pretty much everyone is looking at their young superstar fullback, Reece Walsh, who's been really electric in the NRL, but the big question is, does he have the calmness and maturity to make the right decisions in big moments in Origin? And look, it's an absolutely electric atmosphere here. This is the pinnacle of rugby league, so it should be a good one. Go the Blues.
Thanks, Bindi. Melbourne's Max Gawn says the Demons are facing some hard truths ahead of their King's Birthday clash with Collingwood. Melbourne's form has been very cool after a 92-point loss to Fremantle, and the D's are sitting outside the 8, having won just 2 of their past 5 games. At today's launch of the 10th instalment of the Big Freeze at the MCG, the Melbourne skipper said the Demons have been working hard to correct their form and now have to show it on the field.
We're not the team we want to be. I've stood here a few times this year defending our culture, and I'll stand here again and defend our culture. I think it's where it needs to be off the field, but it's not quite there on.
Yannick Sinner will become the first world number 1 from Italy after Novak Djokovic pulled out of the French Open with a knee injury. Djokovic had qualified for the quarterfinals but won't take to the court. His title defence now over.
This looks a bit more concerning.
Novak Djokovic had a medical timeout early in his 4th round win over Argentina's Francisca Cerundolo. Last night, the 37-year-old withdrew from the tournament, saying, "I played with my heart and gave my all in yesterday's match, and unfortunately, due to a medial meniscus tear in my right knee, my team and I had to make a tough decision after careful consideration and consultation. That decision will see him lose the number 1 ranking."
You will become the first Italian ever to be number 1 in the world.
Australian Open champion Yannick Sinner will officially take the top spot on Monday.
It's everyone's player's dream to become number 1 in the world. In the other way, seeing Novak retiring, it's for everyone disappointing. So I wish him a speedy recovery.
The 22-year-old defeated 10th seed Grigor Dimitrov in straight sets, but it's likely to be less straightforward in the semi-finals when he will face the artistry of the world number 3 from Spain.
The typical finish, Carlos Alcaraz.
Australia's Alex de Minaur will be playing for a place in the semi-finals when he meets German Alexander Zverev.
It's not just myself. I think it's just the whole country is showing what we can do.
The winner of 3 of the past 4 French Opens, Iga Swiatek, has conceded only 2 games in her last 2 matches.
I felt like I was in a zone today.
The Polish player will face American Coco Gauff in the semi-finals. Duncan Huntsdale, ABC News.
It's time to look at the weather now, and tonight's fuel pick of Rainbow Valley, south of Alice Springs, has been sent in by Bailey Farley. Mostly dry and sunny across the NT, some cloud over the Simpson and Lassiter districts as well as the Arnhem district. 32 degrees in Darwin today, 33 at Berry Springs. Zooming out, 29 today in Catherine, 32 in Maningrida and Jabiru 33. A top of 15 in Alice Springs today, 22 in Tennant Creek and 18 in Yulara. On the satellite, there is some low-level cloud stretching into central Australia, some rotating cloud around an upper low in northern New South Wales. A slow-moving high covers much of the country, and there's a trough in the Indian Ocean and Tasman Sea. Interstate tomorrow, a cloudy day in store for Hobart, partly cloudy in Melbourne, rain and 15 for Canberra, rain in Sydney as well. A sunny 23 in Brisbane, Adelaide partly cloudy and rain and a possible storm in Perth tomorrow. Looking at the weather in the Territory tomorrow, partly cloudy and 15 for Alice Springs, 16 in Yuendumu, cloud clearing in Tennant Creek. To the north, Katherine headed for a sunny 27 tomorrow, 26 in Borroloola, Daly Waters sunny and 24. And in the west, sunny and 30 in Bachelor, and a sunny day in Darwin tomorrow, reaching 31. There's a low tide at 11:06 in the morning and an afternoon high tide at 4:37. The sun will rise tomorrow just after 7 o'clock and it will set at 6:28. Dry and below average temperatures through the week. It's likely to warm up from the start of next week. And ahead in Alice Springs, cloud clearing in coming days and temperatures are expected to rise from next week. That's all from the Darwin newsroom tonight. Stay with us now. Sarah Ferguson is up next with 7:30. Good night.